Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics. Today I want to talk a little bit more about the Second Amendment and what it means and how we can know what it means. I promise to be doing some more videos like this, and the good news or the bad news, depending upon how you look at it, is this is going to be the first of 3 parts regarding a very specific thing. I really need the coffee, so... and the title of these videos is going to be called Never Intended, Never Imagined, Part 1, 2, and 3. And it's about the following line of reasoning that people will put forth sometimes when discussing the Second Amendment, and it's from the anti-Second Amendment side, if I can put it that way. And it goes along the lines. They'll say something like, well, the Second Amendment was never intended to cover the kind of weaponry we have today, or the Founding Fathers could have never envisioned the kind of rifles we have today, or pistols that you can shoot, more than 10 times without reloading them, and then you'd have to reload them. But certainly they couldn't have envisioned anything like you reload it from a magazine or a stripper clip or a cartridge or anything like that. And they certainly could have never imagined that a gun could hold more than 10 rounds at a time either. That kind of idea. And they'll say things like, well, they never intended for us to have weaponry that was as good as, or in some cases better than what the military has. So I want to address that, and I want to address it from 3 angles, and I'll tell you what those 3 angles are. This first part is, I'm going to be talking about just the thought process behind that and the logic behind that kind of a statement, and the philosophy and being consistent about what you're saying. The second one, I'm going to deal with, did they actually intend for us to have weapons which were as good as or equal to or better than the military, just in principle. And the third one, I want to deal with the technology itself and whether or not they could have envisioned or imagined the kind of firearms we have today, and whether or not that even makes a difference to the discussion. So let's get right into it. The first part of the discussion, I want to talk about the mindset, the logic behind that statement. If we're going to talk about logic and mindset and things like that being philosophically and logically consistent and making a good argument, we have to kind of talk about what it is to make a fair argument and to make a good argument. Well, if you're going to be fair-minded, what you've got to be able to do is you've got to be able to say, all right, I'm going to present an actual case. I'm not going to just tell you my opinion and say, this is what I think, without backing it up with something. I mean, it's kind of like this. If somebody came along and they said, well, I think Peyton Manning is the best football quarterback who's ever existed. And here's the reasons why. And they go into his record and, I don't know, number of yards run, number of passes completed, number of points scored, all the different statistics, and they'd offer you a case. You could at least say, well, I understand your reasoning, and you've presented an actual case as to why you think Peyton Manning is the greatest quarterback who's ever existed. Now, if somebody else comes along and says, no, I think it was Joe Montana, and you go, oh, really, why? And all they can say is, well, that's just my opinion. Well, they really haven't made a case. All they've done is they've said, that's my opinion. Well, everybody's entitled to an opinion, but we have to be fair-minded and honest enough intellectually to say that some opinions are better informed than others, and that a better informed opinion, or an opinion that has something backing it up behind, other than just, well, that's the way I feel, is a better opinion, and it ought to carry more weight with us. We ought to think more carefully about that, and we'll have to say, well, you know what? You've thought this through more, and probably we should, in deciding things, we should give the question to people who have thought it through more than people who haven't thought it through. So that's just basic intellectual honesty. If somebody comes through and they say something like, well, I think that Peyton Manning was the best quarterback that ever existed, and here are my reasons why, and they give you a bunch of reasons why. And somebody else says, no, I think it was Joe Montana, and here's all of my reasons why. Well, then we can have a conversation. We can discuss all those reasons, or why the statistics that you want to quote aren't the ones that are important, or whatever. And we might not ever actually be able to come to a conclusion that's agreeable to both of us, particularly if we've got an emotional commitment to a particular football team or something. But at least we can have an honest discussion about it. And for people who are watching from the sidelines trying to make up their minds, we're doing a better job and we're being fair to them in the way that we're discussing the issue. I mean, does that make sense? I think it really does. Because sometimes, a lot of times, people will get emotionally wrapped up in an issue, and all they really start doing is shouting their opinion at each other, and they don't really say anything. That doesn't do anything good on either side of the question. Being intellectually honest also means that you're willing to admit to yourself when somebody else makes a better argument than you do. and to say, all right, you know what, that's something I haven't thought of, or you presented a lot of facts and statistics and things like that, and logic and reason, and I may not still agree with you, but at the very least I've got to say, for this moment in time, you've made a better case. And so I've got to give the question to you for the time being. You're the winner, in essence, if you want to put it that crudely, for the time being. But I'm going to kind of go away now and lick my wounds, and I may come back with a better argument later on. It doesn't mean I have to agree with you, but it means that I have to admit, if you make a better case, I've got to admit your logic is better, your facts are better, your statistics are better, and for the time being at least, the argument goes to you, the question goes to you. You've won the argument. If you can't do that, there isn't any reason to have a conversation. All you're doing is you're talking past each other. Nothing ever gets done. Unfortunately, that happens a lot with the issue of the Second Amendment. Well, talking about the mindset behind this question, the question is something along the lines of, or the statement is, well, the Founding Fathers never intended the Second Amendment to cover the kinds of firearms we have today. Well, let's examine that, because going back to constitutional theory, we know that the Constitution, the main body of the Constitution, before we even get the Second Amendment, that was written with a certain idea in mind. And it was written with the following idea in mind, that we start with the people having all the power. The people have all the power. All the power belongs to the people. All the rights belong to the people. The government has no rights and no power except the power given to it by the people. That's a pretty radical notion, by the way, and it's the first time in human history that anybody ever formed a government based upon that principle. So if sometimes the ideas behind American governance and ideas behind the Constitution seem a little radical to you, well, it's because they were. That was a radical idea. Nobody before ever thought that the people have all the power. No. The government had all the power, and the people have whatever rights the government or the crown bestows upon them. But that's where we started. We said the people have all the power, and the reason why we're writing a constitution is to define and set out the very few things that we're going to let government do for us. And we're going to set this out in principle in some cases and in detail in other cases. And if you read the Constitution pretty clearly, wherever they wanted to go into great detail about something, they went into detail about it. You're going to have elections on this day. You're going to have this number of senators. You're going to have this number of people in the House of Representatives. Here is how you're going to go about determining this. This is the powers that are given to the presidency. This is the powers that are given to the Congress. This is the way legislation has to go. They were very specific where they wanted to be very specific. And in other areas, they weren't very specific at all. They spoke in terms of principles, meaning we're not going to go into the specifics because the specifics aren't important. What's important is the principle behind the thing. So we write the Constitution, we say these are the only things you, Mr. Government, Mr. Federal Government especially, gets to do. And we're going to be as specific as we need to be where we want to be specific, and we're going to be speaking in principles where the specifics don't matter. It's the principle of the thing. Now we put together the first amendments, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we refer to as the Bill of Rights, one of them being the Second Amendment. And we lay out some principles, mostly, in those amendments. The First and the Second Amendment lay out principles specifically. For instance, the First Amendment says you have the right to freedom of speech. You have the right to freedom of the press. It doesn't say you have the right to freedom of speech unless you talk too loudly. It doesn't mean that you have freedom of speech only if you don't say too many words. You have freedom of speech. It doesn't mean that you have freedom of the press only until such time that we get beyond a movable type with wooden letters in trays that are really unwieldy to work with, and you can only print so many pages a minute. It means you have freedom of the press, period, in principle. It doesn't matter what the specifics are, okay? And all the other rights. We don't say, for instance, that today, because I can talk to you from 100, 1,000, 3,000 miles away, beaming a message to you over a technology that didn't even exist at their time, that somehow my freedom of speech is now limited by that. No, I can say anything I want. I can say anything I want. I can specifically say anything I want against the government, and there's nothing that the government can do about it. I can say, I think the president stinks. I can say, I think the president is the greatest man who ever lived. I can say, I think Nancy Pelosi ought to be crowned queen tomorrow. And nobody has anything, no, the government doesn't have the right to come along and say, you can't say that. We're putting you in jail. Okay? I have the right to print anything I want to print. And the fact that I can now send things around the world, like there's a way you can print books now where you can send the text of your book and the entire book, actually the layout, to publishing companies around the world so that they can be publishing it in Europe at the same time that they're publishing it in China, at the same time they're publishing it in several parts of the United States and South America. That doesn't mean that the freedom of the press is limited to me now because the technology is different. The principle remains the same. So we have to be fair with the Second Amendment and say, you know what? If we're going to think of the problem one way when we're talking about a matter of principle, we have to talk about that matter of principle when we're relating it to the Second Amendment as well. So if the Second Amendment says that people have the right to keep and bear arms, there are no specifics there. We don't know what the framers actually intended, but we know that they knew how to write things when they wanted to be specific, that were specific, and they knew how to write things in principle when they wanted to be a matter of principle. And clearly, the Second Amendment is one of those things that was written down as a matter of principle. If they wanted to write down the right of the people to own flintlock pistols and muskets shall not be infringed upon, they could have written it, and they probably would have written it. To suggest otherwise, you have to come up with some kind of reason why you're going to say that. The evidence that I give to you is that we can see that they wrote things that were specific when they wanted to in the Constitution, and they wrote things that were not specific and were matters of principle in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, if you want to be on the opposite side of that question and say, no, that's not what they meant. They only meant it to apply to flintlocks and muskets, you have to come up with a reason why you believe that. Why are you saying that language that is very, very general and very, very much expressing a principle means something specific? If you can come up with an argument like that, I really want to know what it is. If you can come up with an argument where the founding fathers actually said or expressed some intent in writing to each other or in debate at the Continental Congress that, well, what we only really want to cover muskets and pistols because we know that technology will be coming along and there will be these scary things that will come. Have at it. Please do so. I mean, I'd like to hear it. I've tried to find things like that and I can't find it. So on its face, the general statement that that they never intended this to be something that would allow us to own weapons that were owned by the military doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And the idea that they only intended it to cover the technology of their time doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Why? Because they didn't say anything along those lines. And so that logic to me just does not hold very well. If you have something that you'd like to offer as an example of where they did say something like that, or they did express some kind of a specific intent, I'd really like to know about it, rather than having a bunch of back and forth in the comment section, because there's the number of characters they give you really is pitiful. Make a video response if you like and tell me where I'm wrong. Give me some evidence, though, because I'll tell you what, if all you're going to come back and do is say, well, it's my opinion that, and you have nothing to back it up, well, then I'm not really going to approve that because you're not really doing anything except gainsaying the argument. So that's dealing with the logic and the mindset and the principles behind the First Amendment and whether or not we can know whether the First Amendment, Second Amendment, and all the other ones were intended to apply to today's times and today's technology. It seems to me to make good sense that when they communicated something as a matter of principle, that they meant it to be applied as a matter of principle. And if we want to start messing around with that definition of things, we ought to have to at least step up to the plate and offer a reason why that wasn't what they meant. I'll be back with part 2 with this in maybe a day or two. That's Zombie Tactics for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.